The original Devil May Cry was so popular because it sort of harkened back to the classic action games. It threw a ton of enemies at you, and the game just had so much style, and it had really great graphics, and it just overall presentation was really good. Obviously, stemming from that, there's going to be high expectations for its sequel, and unfortunately, Devil May Cry 2 doesn't quite live up to the standards set by its predecessor. One of the first problems that you'll notice almost immediately is the game sort of lacks the personality that the original Devil May Cry had. Dante in the first game was sort of this rock star sort of guy, sort of a smart aleck, but in Devil May Cry 2, not only does he not really present this sort of image, but he hardly ever talks in the early portions of the game, and when he does talk later on, it's usually just a few quips and such. It's really a stark contrast to the first game, when he had conversations with a giant magma spider and he sort of just mocked him, or some of the other things that he did. You don't really get a sense of his character in this game, which is sort of unfortunate because it was so prevalent in the original. Joining Dante in Devil May Cry 2 is Lucia, who basically has all the same moves as Dante, only instead of guns and a sword, she has throwing daggers and 2 small blades. She's also a lot faster than Dante, but functionally their moves are basically the same. She can do all the juggles that Dante can. She can run on walls, she can do flips, all the stuff that Dante can do. Both of these characters can perform crazy combinations. You'll see a ranking in the upper right-hand part of the screen that kind of tells you how good that particular combination was. While these combinations look really cool, they really aren't all that practical, especially when you find out that, using Dante or Lucia's default attacks is really much more effective than using combinations. This is true during boss battles, it's true during battles against just some of the regular enemies. You'll just end up standing in a corner or just moving around, throwing the daggers or shooting Dante's pistols. Another problem with Devil May Cry 2, and something that's a little bit of a contrast to the original game, is that you're not really forced to fight all that much. I mean, throughout much of the game, you could just basically run past enemies to get where you need to go. There are parts where you have, the ghost covering the door and you can't get through to the next area, but these are actually pretty rare in the game. So most of the time, you just be running through stretches of the level, just wondering where all the enemies are, and it just really gets sort of boring, especially later on in the game. The catch to this is that obviously you don't get the red orbs if you don't defeat the enemies. Red orbs can be used to upgrade your weapons or buy some of the supplemental items that you can use to regenerate your health or regenerate magic for your devil transformation. But the problem is that there's plenty of red orbs throughout the level anyway, so it doesn't really turn out to be that much of a problem. A good portion of the boss battles, even, you just basically, all you have to do is stand back at a distance and just fire the weapons. You don't really need to get close at all, and the enemies have trouble hitting you. It's really just unfortunate to see that the game doesn't force you to use the combinations a little more, because it would probably make it much more exciting. Throughout the game, Dante and Lucia will come across additional weapons and items for the amulet, which give power-ups to the devil form. For example, if you find this one shard, it will allow you to regenerate health faster than if you didn't have that particular shard when you're in the devil form. Unfortunately, all the secondary or most of the secondary weapons and the amulet, they really don't factor as much as they should into the game. Basically, for Dante, you'll end up using the bazooka, at the very end, but you won't be using any of his other weapons other than his pistols. As for Lucia, you'll be using her crossbow weapon underwater, basically because that's the only weapon she can use underwater. But throughout the rest of the game, you'll just be relying on her throwing daggers. Devil May Cry 2's environments are also pretty disappointing, especially when you compare them to the original game's environments. Instead of having this kind of cool gothic look, you have these really generic levels that could have been used in any other action game, really. You have like an industrial environment, you have like this docking area, you have this town area which has some really horrible bland textures. It's just really disappointing to see how these environments have turned out. It's somewhat understandable that the levels don't look as good, considering that they're much larger in Devil May Cry 2 than they are in the first game. But still, you'll really be disappointed to see how they've turned out. The character models in Devil May Cry 2 actually look quite good. Dante is really detailed, as is Lucia, even though there's some visible clipping in her shirt where her hair goes through. But they both look great. They animate incredibly well, much better than the animation in the first game. It's really amazing to see some of the stylistic moves that Dante can perform. As for the enemies in the game, they look a little bit blocky, which is also understandable considering the development team wants to get as many enemies on screen as possible. And while there's much more variation in terms of enemies in Devil May Cry 2 than there was in Devil May Cry 1, you'll find that they're a little bit a little bit generic at times. You'll have wizards, and you'll have, zombie tanks and zombie helicopters, which, have been used in quite a few other action games. So while there is more variety, it's a little bit standard for an action game. Most of the bosses actually look quite good as well. There is some repetition in Lucia's disc. You'll fight one of the bosses twice. The main bad guy in the game, Arius, also looks quite good. He actually almost looks like a character from the Tekken fighting game series. But generally, yeah, most of the bosses look pretty good. The sound in the game is probably the only thing that really holds true to the original. The music is very similar. You get kind of these guitar riffs and sort of, rock-sounding music tracks mixed in with gothic Castlevania-sounding music. It works well, and it keeps with the theme of the game, though at times it seems like when you're going through like a skyscraper, for example, it starts playing this gothic-type music, and it seems a little bit inappropriate. It just doesn't seem to fit as well as if, the environment had been like a church or something along those lines. The voice acting in the game has been kept to a minimum, which is, might be a good thing to hear for people who didn't particularly care for the voice acting in the first game. In Devil May Cry 2, it's not really bad or anything. There actually isn't all that much dialogue until the very end of the game. But the voice actors do a reasonably good job. They get the point across. Unfortunately, it would have been nice to hear Dante speak a little bit more, but that's not the case in this game. It's worth noting that it only takes around maybe 3 hours to beat Dante's disc and about maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours to beat Lucia's disc. So the game is really short, and the extras really don't seem all that worth it. They don't really necessitate you playing through the game repeatedly. You'll get alternate costumes for both Dante and Lucia, and you'll be able to access a hard mode once you beat the game. So, it's not really worth playing the game over again just to be able to access these things. So, needless to say, Devil May Cry 2 is pretty disappointing. It's still a really solid action game. I mean, some people will have fun trying to do the different combinations, but what it boils down to is that it's really simplistic. The game doesn't take advantage of the features that it offers. You'll end up standing back and just firing, your weapons and tapping the button as fast as you can, like if you're playing track and field or something like that. In the end, it's short length and somewhat repetitive action really prevent Devil May Cry 2 from being a must-buy for the PlayStation 2. The action gets a little bit too repetitive, and it really doesn't take advantage of all the features that are integrated into the game, such as, the amulet and the combination system and all that. So it's definitely disappointing, but at the same time, if you're looking for a solid action game, Devil May Cry 2 is worth the rental. I said that twice.